Greetings. I'm Dominic Longo with Flourishing Gays here in New York City. And I have Bill Glenn and Gregg Cassin in San Francisco. We're here today to have a conversation of HIV veterans reflecting in a time of COVID. A little bit of context, and then we'll do some introductions. Flourishing Gays is an organization that I founded to do leadership development and executive coaching from LGBTQ perspectives. And this event is really meant to be of service to whoever watches it as we all kind of cope with COVID and its effects on our lives. The underlying conviction here is that LGBTQ folks in general have actually very special gifts to give to society, so that when we share our perspectives, everyone gains. That seems particularly true in this moment, and for men like Bill and Gregg, whose lives have been marked by HIV, another virus that disrupted and caused all kinds of havoc. But really the spirit here is one of generosity, their generosity, and really vulnerability as we talk about this tender part of the experience, especially of gay men in the past decades. And depending on how this conversation today goes and the response we get from it and how we find it, I hope that we have some additional follow-up conversations with the three of us and who knows, perhaps others, about whatever other facets of the HIV experience might be relevant today. Again, I'm Dominic Longo, and convening this conversation. And I would ask, with each of you guys, Bill and Gregg, to just introduce yourselves, in particular in kind of positioning yourself as relation to HIV and how it's marked your life, just to kind of say who you are and kind of get us started. Gregg, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you for doing this. Thank you, Dominic. And it is, of course, like, it's beautiful to be doing this with Bill, that we have this long history throughout the epidemic. Our lives were became reconnected through the epidemic. So I moved to San Francisco in 1980, shortly after all of the effects of the epidemic started happening. Found out that I was positive in, the mid 80s. And I'm one of those long-term survivors that went through the days of the epidemic with an incredible amount of support and love, that I was incredibly lucky. I was someone who, I wasn't an activist type person of fighting, in the days of the epidemic. I was more somebody that I felt more comfortable in bringing people together. It seemed that the need for community and bringing people into loving community, dealing with stigma and all those feelings of shame and hope and a lot of denial. And so that's what I did from the early days, from like the late 80s to the present. I've been doing work around bringing people together in community. And now I run a group called Honoring Our Experience out of Shanti here in San Francisco. And it's actually a retreat program founded by and for long-term survivors, because I feel like that's such a profound and unique experience to have lived through those early days, especially as queer men. But we invite everybody to come, long-term survivors, and we have, and we've opened it up to younger people and newly diagnosed people and people that are HIV negative that lived through the epidemic, because it's such a rich story that has so much good and inspiration involved, that it just feels like it would be selfish to not include other people, like younger people and newly diagnosed people. So that being in 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 the middle of that community and being surrounded and with that community of long-term survivors and that shared history has been just an awe-inspiring time of my life. It's just been absolutely the greatest gift. And I couldn't imagine my life being any better than because of that work right now.
Well, it's because of some of how you inspire on others that you're the perfect person to be here today. Thank you so much, Gregg.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Bill, do you mind introducing yourself and just saying a bit about your relationship to HIV and how it's marked your life?
I too want to thank you, Dominic, for pulling this together, and particularly my dear friend, Gregg, my lifelong friend. I'm in the last quarter of my life now, and I would say AIDS is the most significant marker of my life. It changed my life in almost every way. I was a very young man when the epidemic hit, newly husbanded, and gifts that I had that I didn't know I had, like with Gregg, were pulled out of me by the epidemic and the needs of the epidemic. And when I say the epidemic, I really mean the needs of men I loved, and men I came to love, and men I came to grieve and mourn as they died. I was very active in the epidemic from 1984, so year two, to 1999. I spent 15 years providing leadership in the epidemic at several institutions in the epidemic. But as a lifelong psychotherapist, I've had clients until I retired last year, from 1984 until 2018, who have HIV disease. I think the biggest marker of the epidemic for me was it grew me up. I became an adult in the epidemic, and I was required to own myself, my skills, what I could contribute. I was taught patience, taught survival, taught grieving, and I was invited to be present to other people as they also work to acquire those gifts and skills. I have thought of late of my life, had AIDS not occurred, and it's impossible for me to understand what any other trajectory would have for me.
Yeah.
I write about AIDS a lot. I write about the epidemic, but I really write and think about, often on a daily basis, men I loved who died extremely painful, often extremely alone lives. By alone, I mean without the comfort of family or religion, which in the 80s were the true markers for people. And we learned how to care for one another and to become family for one another, how to unabashedly love one another, touch one another, hold one another, and bless each other as one of us died. And it was life-changing in all ways imaginable. Gregg and I have known each other actually since 1980, and we went through, in many ways, the epidemic together while having very different paths. But our connection was marked and solidified by the epidemic, and I would say has been the great grace of our lives, is that we were invited to be present in the epidemic in a way that invited us to be present to life itself.
Wow. Well, I'm struck by how you both, already have just brought this to the growth, the grace, the beauty that this epidemic brought you. It seems like today we're not at that place at all with COVID. We're at a moment of disruption more than anything. The work that I do with Flourishing Gays is focused on bringing especially highly accomplished LGBTQ men together to grow, to change, to support each other through life and connect on substantive levels. Well, in this moment when everything is disrupted, that kind of growth and frankly everything is just topsy-turvy. I myself had my bout of COVID. I got better. I was one of the 80% who have a mild case, but for 2 weeks, as you both know, I was quite sick. And as I'm emerging, well, this conversation is part of what seemed to need to kind of emerge. But disruption, that's really the place I'd like to start a broader conversation of, like, just reflecting on your own life. How did HIV disrupt your world?
You ready, Bill?
You go, Greg. You're ready. I see it.
So, for me, so this is one of the things. I was speaking with a friend of mine yesterday who's an HIV positive woman who's not a long-term survivor, but like several years. And the thing that is, for me, it's unique around this day and those days of the epidemic. Just one of the many, many, many things that are so different was what felt like the slow roll of HIV, that it kind of came on slowly and it came closer and closer, but it took years to do that for me. Like, I heard a drum beat, I heard it coming towards me. I was terrified. I lived in the Castro, like by the 1981, I was in the Castro. I lived in Oakland, I moved over to Castro, and just a handful of blocks away, and everything was transforming before my eyes. And so it's interesting. I haven't had this thought before in this exact way, but that there was always this hum in the background. There was always this fear or this ominous presence in the background of, even in the new days of me being here and just coming out of the closet and having so much joy and possibility, there was this this ominous presence that I knew was going to touch me, either through friends or through my life, that I would become HIV positive. And there was that short period of time that felt like forever, where we didn't know exactly, well, how are you getting it? Is it going to be through a glass that you share at a bar, or is it in the air, or is it like, how is it? So that for me, what is the thing that, like, what is so different now and so terrifying is how it's really a tidal wave or a storm coming at us, and that it seems like we'll know in the next few weeks of one aspect of it, of like, and so yeah, that's what I think, that the slow roll of this ominous presence that felt like it came closer and closer and closer in a slow and scary way.
I just have to note that as you were saying that, here in Lower Manhattan in the East Village, ambulance was going by, and the sirens, I muted myself for a second there because the sirens, which are kind of more common than ever here, I can't help but think, well, probably somebody with COVID is going to the hospital right now. That's what's happening here.
I would say the disruption in my life came in several parts, but the most significant disruption, and this is in a way why it's an honor to be in this phone call with Gregg, because we mirrored each other's lives in many ways over these decades. When I came out of the closet as a 29-year-old man, and 2 years later, my 32nd birthday, I had a party with 10 men whom I loved, had grown to love. And all of those men died within 10 years, except for Gregg Cassin. And for me, in my 30s, I had come out of a religious community in the Jesuits in which my relationships with my brothers were sublimely happy-making. And to make these new friends filled a great hole in me. And to lose my friends was, and still is in many ways, the most significant disruption of my life. Gregg knew all those men. Of course, I met more men during the course of those years. And I say men because the overwhelming majority of people who had HIV in the Bay Area were gay men. Over the course of the epidemic, that changed, and more women and people of color, women of color. But initially, it affected profoundly our community. And I struggled a lot as I really carried several of my friends to their deaths as their bodies grew horribly disfigured by capaces, by pneumocystis, by toxoplasmosis, by wasting. And so men who were beautiful and vital one year within 12 months were in really grotesque physical shape with psychological, emotional, and spiritual ramifications to equal the disfigurement of their bodies. That disruption affected me profoundly. But one of the things it called out of me was to stay present to this. There were men who fled San Francisco because they didn't want to be around this epidemic. And I remember having one couple in particular I resented greatly because they moved to the mountains to escape this. And I thought, this is not to be escaped. So it disrupted my life, but it also grounded my life. And I became aware that there was no place else for me to be on earth or in life, but here in San Francisco with these men who we had been given to each other, and we were to be with and for each other till the end. And it didn't matter ultimately which one of us was going to end, that we were here together. And it was a profound grace that came out of the disruption.
That is, I love that what you said in that we came to each other for comfort. We came to each other for community. We came to each other as San Francisco or cities and places as refuge and sanctuary. And that then you feel some felt a sense of responsibility and duty, and some their calling was to go away, like some, that is, it's one of the things that we talk about on the retreats, is that some couldn't stay, and I feel for that too. I feel like that is like this. I remember the days of walking around the Castro and there being so many for rent signs, and this one kid coming and sitting with me and saying, I had a dream that I was running through the Castro. His partner, he was negative and his partner was dying of AIDS. And he said, Gregg, I'm running through the Castro and all of the doors of the stores are open and all the lights are on, but nobody was here. And I just ran from store to store yelling, is anybody here? Is anybody left? And he's just crying his eyes out. And it was like one of those moments where I had this recognition of, oh, this is as painful for every HIV negative gay man as it is for me and every one of my HIV positive brothers and sisters. Like that it's the same, that it felt like it was taking everything and everyone.
What?
In 1981, the Gay Pride Parade had 1 million people watching this parade. It was filled with floats from the bars and the bathhouses and the gay organizations. And on these floats were really robust, beautiful young gay men dressed in tank tops and shorts. And it was so vital and vibrant. And 10 years later, there was a thought to cancel the parade because all the floats were AIDS organizations, and on the floats were men who were sick and dying of HIV. And the tenor of the community, as your beautiful image, Gregg, of your friend's dream, the tenor of the community was dark and foreboding. And of course, 10 years later, there were yet no drugs, there was no cure, there was no antidote to this. And it seemed that this would never end. That it would never end. This was our lot, and this would take us all out one way or another. It was a very dark time.
I feel like the inheritor, I mean, I'm actually now thinking of the play, The Inheritance, which of course I saw, and I know, Bill, you did when you were here in New York. But inheriting this legacy is one of the themes of that play. And it's, you know, I graduated from college in 1997, the year that the cocktail was kind of devised, and it became available the year after that, from what I understand. But I was not part of the gay world at all for some years after that. So as a, you know, somewhat younger person, but also just coming later to the gay world, I notice how I and men my age, I'm in my mid-40s, have inherited both the things that you've talked about, well, a number of things. The community, those like you two who are extraordinary community builders precisely because of this epidemic, and in the midst of it, running to each other and all the graces. And my generation of gays have also inherited the running away. And I'm not exactly sure how that plays out, except for the ones who are like, oh, I'm not part of the scene, or I don't know, there's some aspect of internalized homophobia that's a collective. I suspect that's part of it. And then there's something that's maybe even more deep in our subconscious about this culture of death or life or vitality or youth idolization that, Bill, your stories of the different pride parades kind of brings up for me.
The traits that a culture takes on, and the gay culture, if I might use that term, took on enormous and searing traits during the 20 active years of the epidemic. There were profound statements about sex, about life, about value, about shame, about gay, about men, about bodies that we absorbed from the larger culture and from our own experience. And I believe that these cultural traits, we don't lose them in a generation or two.
That's right.
I'm Irish. I have traits in me that when I go to Ireland, I see people who are in their 90s. They could be my twins, and they live a peasant life. I come from peasant stock. I'm 3 generations later. I still have that DNA in me, but I have the cultural DNA. And in working with young, I had the real pleasure and grace of working with a lot of young gay men as an older gay therapist for the last 20 years. And the inheritance a lot of these men received, and I would say from the culture, had marks of shame and fear, body negativity, and a lot of encoded statements about sex and sexuality that have a negative cast to them. It's also the inheritance from pre-Stonewall days. The inheritance references that in that play. Boys in the Band, which was a hit last year on Broadway, speaks powerfully to that because it was written in the time of that. And we haven't shed all that yet. But one of the things the AIDS epidemic did was it bonded us together over against all the cultural markers. Gay men grew to love one another intimately and take care of each other in ways that I think changed the larger culture because no one expected it. And we created a subculture of caring as well as a very powerful subculture of infrastructure in which when the world didn't take care of us, we learned how to take care of each other at every level.
I think that is one of the, if you look for like what what do we gain from, you know, from different catastrophic times in one's life or in history, that, and it's one of the things that is also really, really powerful to reflect on when we have large communities of people together, that long-term survivors, that to reframe. So many long-term survivors are people that, many of us went on disability, many of us stepped out of earning during our big earning years. Many of us are living lives that have been greatly impacted by the epidemic and are having different lives that some people had that remained in the workforce and everything. And so many of us have lives that feel, we can feel less than, or we feel like we're different from the rest of of mainstream society, or even mainstream gay society. And it is so powerful to remind and then to reflect on that we were a ostracized, damned community of people, society of people that were told that when we asked for help, we were told that we brought it on ourselves. We told that we were sinners, that we were perverts, that we were wrong, that we were bad. And when we were reaching out for help, like, we had a finger wagging at us and said, like, you made this mess. And I think it has been one of the great gifts for me has been when we recognize, when we come together and we reflect on how noble and heroic our response was, and that this community of people that were told at their, like, at the hour of their deepest need, that they were on their own, that we were able to recognize that we could respond and that we could take care of each other, is such a incredible moment of community and individual self-esteem, to recognize who we became as a result of the epidemic. And it is just, to me, it brings so much joy. And when we share from that place, I have a quick story of, at one point I was hanging out with my mom. She just passed away a couple of years ago, and I was like, Mom, I'm so sorry I'm not that son that can be flying you here or buying you a place and, like, doing this, like, doing what I see a lot of people able to do for their parents. And she said, no, don't you dare say that, don't you dare say that. And she just got really quiet, and she said, we thought we were going to lose you. We can't believe you're still here. You're still here. Don't you ever say anything like that again. And I feel like that is what happens when we come together, when we remember, like, we made history for one another in the way that we responded.
Yes.
And everybody got to benefit from that. Not only just my community, but everybody got to see that. Everybody got to be inspired by that. Like, who is this community that could change in some ways the course of history of their own response, and the way that they changed the way care happened in the United States, the way medical care happened in the United States, the way even just access to drug treatment and everything through ACT UP, and the heroes of that aspect of our fight and response to the epidemic. So when we see, Cory Booker says some beautiful stuff of what is on our resume is often a distraction to what our real resume is of accomplishments. And it's the hurdles that we've gotten through, the fires that we've walked through, the storms that we've lived through. And it just makes me so happy to think about that, and to remind ourselves when we're together, like, that there is something that we taught the world.
Yes. Yes, and Gregg, that's it exactly. I mean, it's that phoenix rising kind of model that you personally are, and that Bill, you are in a different way, but it inspires me. I mean, I've just gotten to know you each really over a little bit more than a year, and I see something in your model that we need, that everyone needs today. Everyone in America needs it. Everyone in the world needs it, because death and destruction is here. A mysterious virus that we don't understand is here. And right now, okay, it's a different dynamic. We're not, shamed and rejected for, but everyone is in their little, I don't want to say closet, but everyone is in their little home, working from home, and in their little kind of compartment, mostly connecting by Zoom to each other. But we're all separated from each other in a way that we're totally not used to. And so what are the possibilities for our transforming into something even more wonderful as a collective, a human community, or as individuals in the face of this crisis? That's the thing that I'm asking you to model somehow, and that you're already doing it.
I want to say something. I don't want to talk too much. I want to hear from Bill, but I just want to say, there was this, the city has asked Shanti, the organization that I work for, to take on the similar role that it did in the epidemic. They have a volunteer program that they're creating for healthy people to come in and to do a response to COVID. And I thought, and very similar to when I first saw Shanti's posters around the Castro, I remember thinking, who will be crazy enough to do that? Who would be brave enough? And I'm a gay man. And I thought, and I didn't really feel that in my heart, but there was this part of me that rationally was like, who the hell is going to respond to this poster? That is a eclipse. The image they used on their poster was an eclipse. I was like, who would be crazy enough / who would be brave enough to do that? So Shanti has this program that they're doing with the city. And so I called up this woman who's the deputy executive director. I'm like, we have to do some kind of, create some kind of campaign, because I'm sure no one's responding to that. Well, they have so many people that have offered to help with that program that they can't contact all the people fast enough. They can't get them, into their positions and out onto the streets fast enough. That so many people responded. And it's like the response to Gavin Newsom, where he said 25,000 people responded to their call for nurses and doctors who are retired or live in other places to come and help. We underestimate, at times, and I think all of us underestimate ourselves and our community and our humanity, like our fellow human beings. And I was just so grateful. I was like, oh, so we don't have to trick them or convince them or beg them to come and volunteer. They're actually, their hearts are just big enough that they're just going to do it on their own.
Can I speak about you, Gregg?
Yeah.
So Gregg is a beautiful man, and he was even a little more beautiful when he was 21. And he had a extremely successful career as a model, a fashion model. And he lived abroad, and he came back to the United States, I want to say in 1986. And he came back, I will say, broken. And he came to live with my husband and me. And he was at sea. His extremely promising career was over. And I don't think he knew his skill set. But the moment that we're in is our teacher. The crisis that we're in is our teacher. And it invites us, it invites a part of ourselves we cannot imagine or foresee until we have the experience of being in the moment. And Gregg was in his moment, and within 3 years, he had a circle of people he gathered around him. every Sunday night, if I'm remembering the day correctly. And he had several hundred people come together on Sunday night to be together in a highly spiritual context, to support one another, learn to love one another, learn to not be afraid of one another, over against death, which was not only outside, death was inside. Because many of the men and women in the group were ill. And the barriers between the ill and the well fell apart, and you couldn't tell. But the moment was Gregg's teacher, the moment was my teacher. And this moment will be actually America's teacher too. The medical profession is having a moment that will change the way medicine is done in our time. And it's the doctors and nurses and other medical professionals who are experiencing this and really putting their lives on the line every day are going to refashion how we do medicine and how we do care. And I think this experience of being separated and alone for great periods of time, even with the gift of Zoom and other face-to-face encounters, is going to invite us to rethink, what does it mean to be for each other? What does it mean to be human beings with each other? That's the epidemic invited us to do that. We didn't know we needed that, but it invited us. And like Gregg, when he came back to the United States as a relatively young man who hadn't a clue what his future held, he's had a 30-year, 35-year, I don't want to say career, I'll call it a vocation, of inviting people to sit with each other and be human beings with each other. And that's the gift of this time too. And you see it in family Zoom calls, you see it in emails from friends, you see it on Facebook postings. On Facebook, people are like salivate, they're thirsty for content. The things people put out are so moving to me. It's the first time I've really thought, I get Facebook, because people are communicating their hopes and desires and their best selves, which the moment is inviting us to experience. So this horrible epidemic is also a great teacher for us of what it means to be human, what it means to be for each other, what it means to be generous of soul.
Well, and that's exactly what's happening here in this conversation among the three of us, being human together in a way that makes sense in this moment. My eagerness to hear more of your stories and to ask these questions. We're going to distribute this conversation through the flourishinggays.com page and also on the Flourishing Gays Facebook page. My hope is that many who watch this will be inspired as I am inspired by you and by the stories that you're bringing. I'd like to have more conversations with you on these themes. There's much more to this topic, and I sense that, and I only have more curiosity and eagerness to hear more as we bring this particular conversation to a close. Again, normally I'm bringing highly accomplished LGBTQ men together to support each other for their own growth and development, and in a mastermind group, or in a retreat, or in a workshop. And that's a real gift to one another. And you certainly are giving that to me. And I think perhaps you've been doing that for each other for the 40 years of your friendship. But what my hope is with this gift that you're giving, that we can spread it out to the whole world. You really do have a great deal. And I believe our community of LGBTQ people more broadly have very special gifts to give to the broader society, and you two demonstrate that and epitomize that.
Can I say a little something?
Yeah, you can, absolutely.
I am so moved by the immediacy of our community of the greater community to respond with gratitude for first responders. For it is amazing. And I think it's really interesting that it's also happening in the LGBT community, in the HIV community. There's just this big moment of reflection of gratitude to heroes and people that were first responders, early responders, through films that have been made over the last few years around people that long-term survivors and people that gave during the epidemic. The film about the first AIDS ward in the United States, that 5B is a film that is basically an acknowledgement to the same group that now we're so grateful to, is to doctors and nurses that put themselves on the line. And now which they had to wait 35 years for a thank you. And we're giving it, 2 months later in this time that we're living in, of this incredible time that we're living through. And I think that is one of the biggest blessings right now, is that power of gratitude. And I've recognized, like, oh my God, there are all these people that are putting themselves on the line. Like where do they get the courage? Where in God's name do they get the courage? It's just amazing. So
yes. Yes.
Thank you, Dominic. And thank you, Bill. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you for having us. I feel like we just stand in place of the hundreds of friends that each of us lost during the epidemic, and all the wisdom that all that loss comes with.
Yes, you're the bearer.
Amazing.
You're the bearers of that, and you're sharing it with me and with everyone who hears this conversation. I'm deeply grateful to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.